You are a newly appointed lady-in-waiting to Queen Marie Antoinette in the year 1780, standing at the golden gates of Versailles Palace for the very first time. Your heart races with anticipation as the massive doors swing open, revealing what everyone has told you is the most magnificent palace ever built by human hands. The morning sun catches the gilded surfaces, sending cascades of light dancing across walls adorned with priceless paintings and mirrors that seem to multiply infinity itself. Your silk slippers whisper against marble floors, so polished they reflect the frescoed ceilings above like pools of liquid stone. Chandeliers drip with thousands of crystals, each one worth more than your father's entire estate. The air shimmers with an almost magical quality as you take your first step into this fairy tale made real. You breathe deeply, ready to fill your lungs with the essence of royal magnificence, and then it hits you. That smell. A wave of human waste so powerful it makes your eyes water. The sickly sweet perfume desperately trying to mask it only makes it worse, creating a nauseating combination that clings to the back of your throat. You see a distinguished courtier in violet silk robes casually relieve himself against a priceless tapestry depicting the glory of Louis XIV. A duchess lifts her enormous skirts in a corner near a marble statue of Apollo. The sound of her urine hitting the floor echoes through the hall of mirrors. No one even glances in her direction. This is normal. This is Versailles, the most beautiful prison of filth ever constructed. Welcome to the real Versailles. Not the sanitized fairy tale of Hollywood movies or romantic period dramas, but the authentic nightmare of Europe's most magnificent palace, where beneath the gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, human beings lived in conditions that would make a medieval peasant recoil in disgust. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see every period drama, every royal romance, every glittering ball scene you've ever witnessed on screen. Because the truth about Versailles isn't just surprising, it's absolutely revolting. But before we dive deeper into this nightmare, you need to understand something that historians have hidden for centuries. Something so disturbing that it was deliberately erased from official records. A secret that involves underground tunnels, a conspiracy of silence, and a truth so revolting that even hardened scholars refuse to speak it aloud. We'll get there. But first, you need to see how this catastrophe began. Let's go back to 1682 when King Louis XIV made the decision that would create this golden catastrophe. The Sun King, as he called himself, wanted to build a palace so magnificent that it would prove to the world that he was chosen by God himself to rule France. He took his father's modest hunting lodge and transformed it into a complex of buildings that housed 10,000 people. 10,000 nobles, servants, guards, and courtiers all living together in what would become the most densely populated palace in European history. But here's what Louis XIV forgot to include in his grand design. Toilets. Actual, functional toilets. In a palace with over 2,300 rooms, there were fewer than 10 permanent facilities for human waste. Let that sink in for a moment. 10,000 people. 10 toilets. The mathematical reality of this situation is staggering. If we assume each person needed to relieve themselves just 3 times per day, that's 30,000 uses of 10 toilets. Each toilet would need to serve 3,000 people daily. Even if everyone waited patiently in line, which nobles certainly would not do, each person would get approximately 28 seconds of toilet time per day. The entire architectural philosophy of Versailles was based on visual magnificence with zero consideration for basic human biological needs. Louis XIV believed that the appearance of divinity was more important than the reality of human function. He created a stage set for the theater of absolute monarchy, where the actors were forced to perform their roles even as their bodies betrayed them in the most humiliating ways possible. But here's what nobody tells you about Louis XIV's decision. It wasn't just ignorance or oversight. The king knew exactly what he was doing. And the reason why will shake everything you thought you knew about Versailles. But we're not there yet. First, you need to meet the people who had to survive this nightmare. Your first day as Marie Antoinette's lady-in-waiting quickly becomes an education in the practical realities of palace life. An older woman named Madame de Clermont takes you aside with a knowing smile that doesn't reach her eyes. She leads you through a series of corridors, pointing out locations with the casual expertise of a tour guide showing off monuments. That corner behind the statue of Venus, she says, highly sought after in the evenings. Good privacy, but the marble can be cold. She gestures toward an alcove draped with expensive tapestries. The Duc de Bourbon prefers that spot, best to avoid it after his morning coffee. You realize with growing horror that she's creating a map, not of artwork or historical significance, but of where various nobles prefer to defecate. Madame de Clermont explains the unwritten rules of palace elimination with the same serious tone others might use to discuss proper curtsy depth or forms of address. Never use a spot immediately after someone of higher rank, she instructs, and always check the gardens before dawn. That's when the servants do their cleaning rounds, and you don't want to be caught in an awkward position. The gardens. You had imagined romantic strolls among perfectly manicured hedges and fountains. Now you learn that these celebrated gardens of Versailles serve a secondary, far more practical purpose. They're the palace's primary toilet. The famous orangery, with its 1,200 orange trees and silver planters, became known among servants as the perfumed latrine. The fragrance of orange blossoms wasn't just decorative, it was desperately necessary. The elaborate hedge mazes that tourists still walk through today were designed with alcoves that Louis XIV's architects claimed were for private conversations. They were lying. Those alcoves were strategically placed toilet stations. Historical records from the palace archives reveal that André Lenotre, the legendary landscape architect who designed the gardens, actually included relief stations in his original plans. He understood what his employer refused to acknowledge, that thousands of people living in close quarters would need somewhere to go. But Louis XIV ordered these practical elements removed from the final architectural drawings. They ruined the aesthetic purity of his vision. And here's the part that will make your skin crawl. When Lenotre protested, Louis XIV told him something chilling. Something that suggests the king wasn't just ignoring the problem. He was using it as a weapon. We'll come back to that. But first, you need to understand what happened when the most powerful people on earth couldn't find a place to shit. For those nobles wealthy enough to afford them, there was an alternative to public elimination. The chaise percée, literally pierced chair, was a portable toilet disguised as an expensive piece of furniture. These elaborately decorated chairs with hidden chamber pots became status symbols among the aristocracy. But here's where the situation becomes even more bizarre. Owning a chaise percée wasn't enough. You needed servants to carry it. And not just carry it, but carry it with you as you move through the palace. Imagine attending a royal council meeting where several nobles have brought their portable toilets, using them openly during discussions of state policy, while servants stand behind them, waiting to remove the waste. Louis XIV himself conducted government business from his chaise percée every single morning. This wasn't a private affair. This was a public ceremony called the Lever du Roi, the King's Rising. Dozens of courtiers would compete for the honor of watching their monarch defecate while he signed official documents and made decisions about war, taxation, and foreign policy. The king's chief physician, Antoine d'Aquin, kept detailed records of Louis XIV's bowel movements, preserved in the royal archives. We know that the Sun King suffered from chronic constipation and hemorrhoids, conditions that turned his daily toilet ceremony into an often painful ordeal lasting up to an hour. Meanwhile, courtiers stood in respectful attendance, maintaining serious expressions while their king grunted and strained on his golden chaise percée. This wasn't considered degrading. This was considered an honor. The closer you stood to the king during his morning toilet, the more political access you had. Nobles literally fought for the privilege of watching Louis XIV defecate. But this public humiliation served another purpose. One that Louis XIV calculated with brutal precision. By forcing his nobles to witness his most intimate moments, he was teaching them a lesson about power that no one dared to forget. And this brings us closer to the darkest secret of Versailles, the one historians won't touch. Stay with me. But most people at Versailles didn't have portable toilets or access to the limited permanent facilities. They had the staircases. The palace's 67 staircases became unofficial public toilets, especially the back staircases used by servants. By the evening, these passages were so soaked with urine that the stone steps became dangerously slippery. Multiple courtiers fell and injured themselves, sometimes fatally, on stairs made treacherous by human waste. The palace employed an entire corps of workers whose only job was to clean the staircases every night. These unfortunate souls, called night soil men, would scrub and scrape at stones that had absorbed decades of urine and feces. The limestone itself had become porous, soaking up waste like a sponge. No amount of cleaning could fully remove the stains or the smell. One visitor to Versailles in 1715, the Duchess of Orleans, wrote in her personal correspondence, "The staircases, the courtyards, and the corridors are filled with urine and fecal matter." A gentleman of the court saw someone defecating in the passageway, and the man said to him quite naturally, "I needed to relieve myself. It is impossible to leave one's apartments without seeing somebody pissing." The smell was so overwhelming that it seeped into the very walls of the palace. Tapestries that had cost fortunes to commission absorbed the stench like fabric sponges. Paintings in their gilded frames developed a film of organic matter. The famous Hall of Mirrors, Louis XIV's crowning architectural achievement, regularly smelled like a public urinal. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because the staircases weren't just accidentally filthy. Documents discovered in the palace archives in 1923 and immediately resealed suggest something far more sinister. The Sun King had a plan, and it involved keeping his nobles literally swimming in their own filth. Why? The answer will horrify you. This is where perfume enters our story. You've probably heard that French perfume became world famous during this period. What you might know is why. Perfume wasn't a luxury. It was a survival mechanism. The town of Grasse in southern France had been a center for leather tanning since the Middle Ages. Leather workers used strong scents to mask the smell of their trade. But in the 17th century, as Versailles descended into its crisis of sanitation, Grasse pivoted its entire industry toward perfume production. Nobles at Versailles would douse themselves in perfume multiple times per day. Not just a polite dab on the wrists, but liberal application all over their bodies and clothing. They carried scented handkerchiefs that they held to their noses while walking through corridors. They installed elaborate devices in their apartments that burned scented oils constantly. Marie Antoinette had a personal perfumer who mixed custom scents designed specifically to mask human waste odors. Her famous preference for violet and rose wasn't about feminine elegance. It was about survival. The Queen's private correspondence reveals that she suffered from constant headaches, which modern doctors believe were caused by the combination of overwhelming perfume and underlying waste odors. The French perfume industry that we celebrate today, that billion-dollar cultural institution, was born from desperation. Every bottle of Chanel, every vial of Dior, every prestigious French fragrance carries in its DNA the memory of Versailles and its rivers of human waste. But perfume wasn't just about masking smells. It was about masking something else, something that connects directly to Louis XIV's true intentions. And we're finally ready to reveal what historians have been hiding, the secret that changes everything. Let's return to those famous gardens for a moment, because the situation there was even worse than in the palace itself. The gardens of Versailles cover 2,000 acres. During major court events, thousands of people would gather outside for parties, concerts, and elaborate theatrical performances. Where did all these people relieve themselves? Everywhere. The bushes, the fountains, behind the statues, in the groves, the famous topiary that took gardeners years to shape became public urinals. The elaborate water features that cost fortunes to engineer regularly became clogged with human waste. The palace kept a team of gardeners whose sole responsibility was waste management. Every morning before dawn, these workers would walk through the gardens with wheelbarrows, shovels, and buckets, collecting the previous day's deposits. Historical accounts describe this as one of the most degrading jobs in all of France. But here's makes this even more horrifying. The gardens were designed for public display. Louis XIV wanted everyone to see his magnificent creation, so the gates were open to anyone well dressed enough to appear respectable. This meant that not just courtiers, but also visitors from Paris and beyond would use the gardens as their personal toilet. On festival days, when the palace might host 10,000 visitors in addition to its regular inhabitants, the gardens became what one contemporary observer called an open sewer masquerading as paradise. And now we need to talk about what the gardeners found. Because while cleaning human waste every morning, they discovered something that the palace wanted kept secret: evidence of Louis XIV's true plan. Evidence that proves this wasn't incompetence, it was strategy. Hold that thought. Because first, you need to understand what this filth did to the people who lived in it. The health implications of these conditions were catastrophic, though nobody at the time understood the connection between sanitation and disease. Court physicians documented an endless parade of illnesses that swept through Versailles with terrifying regularity. Dysentery, typhoid fever, cholera, and various unnamed putrid fevers killed nobles and servants alike. Children born at Versailles had horrifying mortality rates. Of Marie Antoinette's 4 children, only one survived to adulthood, and modern historians believe the palace's sanitation played a significant role. The palace's water supply, drawn from the same grounds where thousands eliminated daily, was contaminated beyond measure. People drank this water, they cooked with it, they washed with it. The famous fountains that still delight tourists today were fed by the same system that people downstream used for drinking water. Skin infections were so common among courtiers that they were considered normal. The elaborate makeup that we associate with this period, those white, lead-based foundations and bright red rouge, served multiple purposes. Yes, they created the fashionable pale look, but they also covered the sores, rashes, and infections that resulted from living in constant contact with human waste. Louis XIV himself suffered from numerous health problems that his doctors attributed to bad humors and corrupted blood. Modern analysis of his symptoms suggests he was probably suffering from chronic infections related to poor sanitation. The Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, was slowly being poisoned by his own palace. Or was he? Because here's what medical historians discovered when they analyzed Louis XIV's actual health records. The king was suspiciously healthy compared to everyone around him, almost as if he knew something they didn't, almost as if he had taken precautions. And that brings us to the conspiracy that changes everything. Marie Antoinette, arriving at Versailles as a 14-year-old Austrian princess, was horrified by what she found. Her letters to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, carefully avoided direct criticism of her new home, but between the lines, we can read her disgust. The young queen began what can only be described as a personal sanitation rebellion. She commissioned the construction of private apartments with actual plumbing, a nearly unprecedented luxury. She bathed daily, which her doctors warned would be dangerous to her health. She insisted on regular changes of clothing, going through multiple outfits per day despite mockery from older courtiers who considered this excessive. Most significantly, she began spending more and more time at the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace on the grounds of Versailles that she could control completely. There, she installed multiple water closets, proper drainage, and strict sanitation rules. Her famous rustic village, the Hameau de la Reine, wasn't just a fantasy of pastoral life. It was an escape from the filth of court. But this only increased resentment toward her. The old nobility saw her sanitation efforts as an insult to French traditions. They spread rumors that her obsession with cleanliness was evidence of foreign corruption, that true French nobles didn't need such luxuries. Some historians believe that this contempt for her hygiene standards contributed to the hatred that eventually sent her to the guillotine. The revolution that would ultimately kill Marie Antoinette used the squalor of Versailles as propaganda. Revolutionary pamphlets described the palace as a cesspool of aristocratic excess, where nobles literally shit on the people's heritage. They weren't entirely wrong. Now we come to one of the most persistent and disturbing legends about Versailles, the so-called odor tunnels. Some historical accounts claim that Louis XIV, finally acknowledging the sanitation crisis late in his reign, ordered the construction of underground tunnels designed to ventilate the worst odors away from the main palace buildings. These tunnels supposedly ran beneath the courtyards and gardens, with grates positioned to draw away the worst of the stench. The problem is that no definitive archaeological evidence of these tunnels has ever been found. Some historians believe they existed but were destroyed during the French Revolution when the palace was looted and renovated. Others think they're entirely mythical, a legend created to make the sanitation situation seem less catastrophic than it actually was. What we do know is that the palace archives contain multiple contracts with engineers and architects for ventilation improvements and air quality management systems. Whatever these projects actually were, they clearly failed to solve the fundamental problem. The palace tour guides today will never mention this. The restored Versailles that millions visit each year smells pleasantly of floor polish and fresh flowers. The golden gates open onto rooms that breathe with preserved magnificence. The gardens bloom in perfect geometric patterns. Every surface gleams with careful restoration. But if you know where to look, you can still see evidence of the nightmare. Stone walls with strange discoloration that no amount of cleaning can remove. Drainage systems that seem oddly overbuilt for mere rainwater. Architectural features that make no sense unless you understand their original purpose as makeshift sanitation solutions. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and one of its first actions was to storm Versailles and drag the royal family to Paris. When revolutionary forces took control of the palace, they found a building in severe decay, not from age, but from decades of abuse by its inhabitants. The revolutionary government briefly considered turning Versailles into a public hospital or school. But the building was in such poor condition, the walls so saturated with waste, the stone so damaged by constant moisture, that they deemed it nearly uninhabitable. For years, the palace stood empty, slowly deteriorating, while revolutionary France tried to decide what to do with this monument to royal excess. The restoration of Versailles didn't begin until the 1830s, under King Louis Philippe. By then, much of the original interior had been stripped for materials or left to rot. The restoration involved not just repairing damage, but completely gutting and replacing entire sections of the building whose stone had become structurally unsound from decades of exposure to human waste. Modern Versailles is, in many ways, a reconstruction. A beautiful lie we tell ourselves about the past. The real Versailles, the palace where Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette actually lived, was demolished from the inside by the accumulated filth of its inhabitants. Here's the most bitter irony of this entire story. While the French nobility lived in their golden cesspool, regular French peasants had better sanitation. Medieval and early modern villages typically had communal toilets, built over running water or deep pits, regularly cleaned and emptied. Peasant homes often had simple but functional latrines. The very people whom Louis XIV considered beneath his notice lived in conditions that were, from a sanitary perspective, far superior to his magnificent palace. The Sun King, in his obsession with creating a physical manifestation of his absolute power, built a palace that literally poisoned its inhabitants. His determination to prioritize appearance over function created living conditions that would have been considered intolerable in any other context. And yet nobles competed desperately for the privilege of living there. Because at Versailles, despite the filth and disease and degradation, you were close to power. And in the politics of absolute monarchy, proximity to the king was worth any price, even your health, your dignity, and possibly your life. When you turn off this video and return to your clean modern life, remember this story. Remember that beneath every glossy period drama, every romanticized portrayal of royal life, lies a reality that Hollywood will never show you. The courtiers and their silk and jewels weren't living in a fairy tale. They were living in a biological nightmare of their own creation, where the pursuit of status and power trumped every basic human need. They maintained composure, conducted politics, and shaped European history while literally wading through human waste. The next time you watch a movie set at Versailles, imagine the smell. Imagine the sounds of people relieving themselves in corners. Imagine the queen in her magnificent gown, which hasn't been properly cleaned in weeks, trailing through corridors slick with urine. Imagine the king conducting state business while defecating in front of an audience. This is not ancient history. This happened in the lifetime of America's founding fathers. While Thomas Jefferson was writing about natural rights and human dignity, the most powerful nobles in Europe were living in conditions that violated every principle of both. The magnificent palace still stands, its golden gates still gleaming in the French sun. Millions of tourists walk its halls each year, marveling at its beauty, and beneath all that restored glory, saturated into stone that no amount of cleaning will ever fully purify, remains the memory of what really happened in those gilded halls. Versailles teaches us that magnificence and misery can coexist. That appearance can mask almost any reality if the illusion is beautiful enough, and that sometimes the most powerful people in the world choose to live in hell, as long as it's a hell covered in gold leaf. The staircase beneath your feet still smells of perfume, desperately trying to mask something that no amount of restoration will ever completely erase. You are standing in the most beautiful nightmare ever constructed by human hands. Welcome to Versailles. Try not to breathe too deeply.